What if the house you once lived in was hiding a secret so terrifying that an entire town chose to forget it? What if a single swing of a sledgehammer could open a door into a past that was never meant to be uncovered? In the winter of 1993, an old two-story house stood on the edge of a small town in western Pennsylvania. Built in the late 1930s for local factory workers, the building had been abandoned for decades. Its roof sagged under years of neglect, windows stared out like empty sockets, and the walls had darkened with dampness. The city had finally decided to tear it down and replace it with new housing. That morning, Foreman Richard Martin arrived at the site earlier than his crew. The air was sharp and brittle, so cold that each breath turned instantly into a cloud of white vapor. Snow crunched under his heavy boots, the sound unnervingly loud in the stillness. Richard paused by the darkened facade, staring at the rotting frame of the house. Almost without realizing it, he crossed himself, though he hadn't considered himself a believer in years. Inside, the air was even colder than outside, and heavier, as if the house itself was holding its breath. It smelled of mold, wet wood, and something else. Something metallic and sickly sweet that made him want to hold back his breathing. His flashlight beam revealed curling strips of wallpaper, cracked plaster, and a broken table left behind long ago. Nothing unusual for a forgotten house. But then, at the far end of the hallway, he noticed something strange. One wall in the back room didn't match the rest. The bricks looked newer, unevenly laid, as though someone had built it in a rush. Richard stepped closer and ran his palm across the plaster. The surface felt rough, irregular. A frown creased his face. Something about this wall was wrong, and he knew it the moment he touched it. He hesitated, then tightened his grip on the sledgehammer. Curiosity overpowered caution. With a grunt, he swung hard. The blow echoed dully, dust bursting into the air. He swung again, then once more. On the third strike, a piece of the wall gave way, opening a narrow cavity. His flashlight beam slid into the darkness and landed on something pale, like fabric. His pulse quickened. He smashed at the bricks until the hole widened, then leaned closer to peer inside. What he saw made him stumble back so violently he dropped the flashlight. In the hollow space lay a human skeleton, wrapped in rotting cloth that might once have been a bedsheet. The empty sockets of the skull seemed to stare straight at him. Beside the bones sat a small rusted tin box. Richard stood frozen for a long moment before forcing himself to reach inside. His stomach twisted, but his fingers closed around the box and dragged it out. The lid creaked open, stiff with rust. Inside lay a leather-bound diary, its cover cracked, its pages yellowed with age. Richard turned the first page, his hands trembling. In faded ink were the words, "Diary of Mary Hudson, 1956. For a moment he couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. His fingers shook against the brittle paper. He realized, with a cold weight settling in his chest, that this house was never just an abandoned ruin waiting to be demolished. Its walls had been hiding a story, one someone had tried to bury forever. The police arrived quickly. The old house was sealed off, the workers told to stay away. The frozen morning filled with flashing lights, the crunch of boots on snow, and the clipped voices of officers. Richard stood aside, chain-smoking, his eyes fixed anywhere but the dark hole in the wall. The investigators carefully removed the remains. The medical examiner examined the bones right there on the spot. A woman, around 30 years old, hidden away for at least 3 decades. The diary, sealed inside a clear evidence bag, was passed into official hands. Back at the precinct, the diary landed on the desk of Detective Robert Miller. He had worked homicide for nearly 20 years, seen cases bloody, hopeless, and cruel. But this was different. Too old. Too strange. He opened the first page and saw neat handwriting in faded ink. Diary of Mary Hudson, 1956. The entries began in January. At first, they seemed ordinary. Mary wrote about her husband John working as a mechanic at the factory, about their 7-year-old son Andrew, about the hard winter and the price of coal. Everyday details, small complaints. But between the lines was a quiet unease, a shadow of something unspoken. By February, the tone had shifted. Mary wrote of John coming home late, smelling not only of alcohol but of something else. "A smell I can't describe," she noted. "But it makes my skin crawl." She wrote of his temper, how he had struck her once, and how his eyes carried something new, something she no longer recognized. "It frightens me," she confessed on the page. The entries grew darker. She heard noises at night in the basement, hammering, muffled voices. John disappeared for hours, slipping out after midnight and returning silent, brooding. Mary wrote that she was afraid for their son, but didn't know what to do. The final entry was dated March 3, 1956. The handwriting was hurried, uneven. "Tonight I found something in the basement. I cannot believe John is capable of this. I must go to the police, but I fear for Andrew. What if he hurts the boy? Tonight, after John falls asleep, I will take Andrew and go to my mother's. If anyone is reading this, it means I didn't make it." The words ended there. Miller closed the diary and sat still for a long time. Outside his office window, snow drifted down and people hurried through their day, carrying groceries, walking to work. Ordinary life carried on as though nothing had changed. But in those faded pages, the quiet voice of a woman long dead had already confirmed the truth. She had not escaped. The case seemed simple at first glance. An abusive husband, a violent night, a vanished wife. But the diary left something unsettled. The strange smells, the sounds from the basement, the half-glimpsed details she never dared describe. Miller felt it in his bones. This was only the beginning. The case was assigned to Detective Robert Miller. In town his name carried weight. 2 decades in homicide, dozens of solved cases, and a reputation for being calm where others faltered. Yet even for him, this investigation felt different. It had begun with bones sealed behind a wall and the faded words of a woman who had vanished from history. Miller went to the county archives. The building smelled of dust and old paper, the kind of place where time itself seemed reluctant to move. He spent hours combing through brittle files, until finally he found it. A thin folder dated 1956. Inside was the original missing persons report. John Hudson himself had walked into the station and declared that his wife Mary had left the house after an argument and never returned. The police at the time had done what they could. They interviewed neighbors, checked bus stations, even called local hospitals. But nothing surfaced. No luggage left behind at the depot, no accident reports, no trace of her at all. The final summary was painfully brief. Disappearance. No evidence of foul play. Case closed. Miller sat in the dim light of the archive room and read those words again. A woman vanished. Her husband shrugged. The police closed the file. And for almost 40 years, her body lay hidden in the walls of the house she once called home. The banality of the report felt obscene, as if an entire life had been reduced to a paragraph of administrative language. He began knocking on doors, looking for anyone still alive who remembered the Hudsons. A few elderly residents were willing to talk, though reluctantly. Their recollections, fragmented and softened by time, still carried the same chilling undercurrent. They remembered John as a man who withdrew from the world after his wife's disappearance. He rarely spoke, went straight to work and back, sat on his porch in the evenings with a bottle, staring off into nothing. One neighbor recalled that people avoided his gaze. It was heavy, unsettling, as though he carried something inside that others instinctively feared. An old woman named Margaret, her voice trembling with age, offered the clearest memory. "I saw him with the boy," she said. "Little Andrew, pale as chalk, always looking frightened. John held his hand too tightly, pulling him close, like he was afraid the child might run. And then, one summer night, they were gone. Vanished. By morning, the house was empty." Her words matched a note Miller had found in the employment records. In 1957, John Hudson resigned from his job at the factory. He left town without explanation, taking his son with him. There were no forwarding addresses, no records of where they went next. The trail simply ended. Miller returned to his office long after dark, the file and the diary resting heavily on his desk. He stared at the evidence, piecing together a picture of a man, silent, withdrawn, clutching his son, retreating into the shadows after his wife's disappearance. For decades, the story had been nothing more than whispers and an old, forgotten police report. But now the wall had broken open, and the silence that had protected John Hudson for so long was beginning to collapse with it. The demolition of the old house was put on hold. After the discovery inside the wall, Detective Miller insisted that nothing be touched until he had searched the basement. The stairs leading down were narrow, uneven stone steps, slick with dampness. Each step carried him deeper into a place where the air grew thicker, colder, and harder to breathe. The basement was small and low-ceilinged, the brick walls bare and sweating with moisture. Rusted cans and broken crates slumped in the corners. Rotten planks leaned against the wall, their surfaces covered with mold. But one detail stood out. Several beams supporting the ceiling looked newer than the rest, as though someone had replaced them hurriedly, without care for alignment. Miller ran his hand along one of the beams. The wood felt different, fresher than the rotted timbers around it. He motioned to his team. The officers pried it loose, and behind it, a small cavity appeared. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in oily cloth. The detective crouched as one of the men unwrapped it. The fabric peeled back to reveal a glint of metal, an old military knife, its wooden handle worn smooth with use. The blade was stained with rust, but beneath the corrosion were darker marks, embedded deep in the steel. They weren't from time. They were from blood. Later testing would confirm Miller's suspicion. The knife carried traces from at least 3 different people. Not 1, not 2, 3. Miller stared at the weapon, silent. This was no accident, no forgotten relic. Someone had hidden it deliberately, sealed it away, just as they had sealed bones into the walls upstairs. But the past, no matter how carefully buried, was pushing its way back into the present. That evening, Miller returned to the archives. He combed through brittle newspapers, yellowed police reports, the kind of forgotten clippings that only surface when someone is willing to dig through dust for hours. And there they were, 3 short notices, spread across 3 winter months in 1955 and 1956. 3 stories no one had ever connected. December 1955. A young woman, a night shift worker at the bakery, vanished on her walk home. She never arrived at her apartment. Family filed a report. Police searched the streets, but she was gone. The article ended with the hollow phrase, "Investigation ongoing." Nothing more was ever written. January 1956. An elderly night watchman at the lumber mill failed to report for duty. His cabin was empty, his tools left untouched. The report speculated that he might have wandered into the forest and succumbed to the cold. Within a month, the case was closed. February 1956. A teenager attending evening classes never returned home. He had been working part-time at the factory during his school break. Friends said he left as usual one night, but he never arrived. His disappearance was noted briefly in the paper. No leads. 3 different lives. 3 different disappearances. Each explained away at the time as an accident, a runaway, or just bad luck. None of them ever solved. No one thought to draw a line between them. Now Miller had a knife, stained with the blood of at least 3 people. He leaned back in his chair at the archive table, the weight of the files pressing down on him. The hum of the fluorescent light above was the only sound in the room. The cases were no longer fragments. They were a pattern. And the house on the edge of town was not only a tomb for Mary Hudson. It was the hiding place for something darker, something that had swallowed 3 other lives before hers. For decades, the silence of the town had let the story fade. But with every step into that basement, every record pulled from the dust, Miller felt the quiet truth rise closer to the surface. This was not over. It had never been over. Miller kept digging into the past of John Hudson. Factory records gave him almost nothing, just a resignation date and the signature of a supervisor. But the county draft board kept older files. It was there that Miller found Hudson's military record. John Hudson was born in 1921, enlisted during the Second World War, and served in Europe. In 1944, he was captured, spending nearly a year in a prisoner of war camp. He was released in May 1945. The medical notes listed concussion, nervous exhaustion. The language was clinical, detached, but one phrase stood out: traumatic neurosis. Today, it would be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, but at the time such diagnoses had no clear definition. Miller studied the papers for a long time. They painted the outline of a man who never truly came back from the war. After his return, Hudson tried to settle into normal life. He took a job at the factory, married Mary, and soon their son was born. But beneath that fragile surface, something dark grew. Neighbors remembered the drinking, the sudden fits of rage, the nights when he vanished without explanation. They remembered long stretches of silence broken by violent outbursts. The war had left scars deeper than the medical charts could capture. Hundreds of men returned changed, but not all of them turned into shadows of themselves the way Hudson did. Something in captivity had broken him, or perhaps reshaped him. Mary had written that his eyes no longer looked like his own, that there was something foreign, something frightening in them. Miller felt the weight of it pressing on him. Whatever had happened to John Hudson between the battlefield and his return home, that was where the key lay. Somewhere in that lost year, in the camps and cellars of Europe, the man who came back was not the same as the one who had left. The war had ended, but its shadow lingered. It was still alive in this house, in these records, and in the dark silence surrounding John Hudson's name. Took Miller weeks to track him down. The boy who had once vanished with his father was no longer a boy. Andrew Hudson had grown into a man in his 40s, living under a different last name, far from the town where the house still stood. When Miller finally knocked on his door, Andrew looked wary, as if he had been expecting this moment for years. They sat in a modest living room, the curtains drawn against the late afternoon light. Andrew's hands fidgeted on the armrest of his chair. His voice was low, steady at first, but underneath it trembled something old and raw. "I remember that night," he said. "I remember it too well. I was 7 years old. My mother woke me in the middle of the night. She told me we had to leave. She was scared. I could hear it in her whisper, see it in the way her hands shook. She kept looking toward the door, like she expected him to come in at any second." Andrew paused, staring at the floor as though he could see the scene unfolding there. "We didn't make it out. He was waiting in the hallway. My father. He didn't yell. He didn't even look angry. He was calm. Too calm. That's what I'll never forget. His eyes. They didn't look like my father's eyes anymore. The boy inside the man spoke again. They argued. She shouted at him, told him she knew what he was doing in the basement. She said she would go to the police. He told her she didn't understand, that he had no choice. And then, his voice broke. Then he picked up something heavy. A flat iron, I think. He struck her. Just once. She fell. I screamed, but he pulled me back. He told me she'd gone away, that I must never speak of it, that if I told anyone, I'd never see her again. For a moment the room was silent except for the ticking of a clock on the wall. Andrew rubbed his face with both hands before continuing. A few nights later, he woke me up, told me to help him. We went to the front room. He'd already torn open part of the wall. I didn't understand. I thought it was some kind of repair. He made me hold the bricks, pass him tools. We worked for hours. And then he told me to spread plaster over it. I did it because I was a child. I didn't know. But now I know that my mother was on the other side of that wall the whole time. Miller listened, his pen motionless above his notebook. There's more, Andrew whispered. The basement. I used to hear sounds from down there. Groans, muffled crying sometimes. And voices. Not like conversations, more like chanting or muttering. My father would lock himself in for hours. When I asked him, he told me it was my imagination. But I heard it. I know I did. He shook his head slowly. As I grew older, I learned not to ask questions. I learned to look away. But I could never escape the feeling that something in that house was alive. Something that didn't belong to us. The walls kept secrets, and I was trapped inside them with him. Miller closed his notebook without writing a word. He didn't need ink on paper to remember this. The man sitting across from him had just confirmed what the diary, the bones, and the knife had already suggested. The Hudson house was not only a crime scene. It was a grave. And worse, it was a witness to things no child should ever have heard in the dark. When their conversation seemed to have reached its end, Andrew hesitated. He stood up, walked into another room, and returned carrying a small, locked metal box. He set it on the table between them, his hands lingering on the lid as though reluctant to let go. My father left this with me before he died, Andrew said quietly. He told me I would understand someday. I never did. Not completely, but I kept it. I couldn't throw it away. He opened the box. Inside lay an old book, its leather cover cracked and darkened with age. The corners were frayed, and the spine was fragile. Across the front there was no title, only deep scratches, as if someone had deliberately tried to erase whatever had once been there. Miller leaned forward as Andrew lifted it out. The pages were yellow, brittle, filled with tight, slanted handwriting in German. The ink had faded to brown, but the words were still legible. Andrew explained he didn't read the language, but years earlier he had shown a few pages to a colleague who knew some German. What he told him had been enough to make Andrew lock the book away again. It's a diary, Andrew said, belonging to an officer, SS from the war. He wrote about experiments, prisoners, human experiments. Miller turned a few pages slowly. Even without translation, the sketches and numbers chilled him. Diagrams of bodies, lists of names, columns of measurements. On several pages, strange geometric symbols were drawn in the margins, circles, stars, shapes that looked more ritual than scientific. The entries Andrew's colleague had translated described attempts to strip fear from men through drugs, isolation, and something else. Something the officer never named directly. He referred to rituals of the ancients and energies that awaken obedience. The words were clinical, but beneath them pulsed a disturbing fascination, as though the officer believed he was creating more than soldiers, something beyond human. Andrew swallowed hard. "I think my father was one of them, one of the prisoners they tested. That's why he changed." His voice broke, and he pressed the book shut. Days later, back at the house, Miller supervised another sweep of the basement. This time, one of the crime scene technicians called him over. Hidden behind a section of brick near the far wall, they uncovered a small object wrapped in cloth. When the fabric was peeled away, a figure stared up at them. It was a crude sculpture, no taller than a man's hand, carved from dark metal. The shape was human, but twisted, its limbs elongated, its face distorted. Across its surface were etched the same kinds of symbols Miller had seen in the diary. Circles intersected by jagged stars, lines curling into shapes that almost seemed to move in the light. The figurine was cold to the touch, heavier than it looked. Miller could not shake the feeling that it had been waiting there, hidden, patient through the decades. The book, the symbols, the figurine. Each piece whispered the same truth. John Hudson's darkness had not been born from nothing. It had roots reaching back across the ocean, into the war, into rituals that science never admitted and history never recorded. And now those roots had surfaced in a basement in Pennsylvania, where a woman's voice in a diary had already warned that she had seen too much. Miller took the figurine and the book to a university professor, an historian who had spent years studying the strange crossroads between Nazi ideology and the occult. The man was gray-haired, precise, not given to exaggeration. Yet when he examined the pages and turned the cold figure in his hand, his expression hardened. "These symbols," he said, pointing to the intersecting stars and circles, "predate Christianity. They are remnants of pre-Germanic cults, rituals designed to channel strength, obedience, even cruelty." The Nazis were fascinated by such things. They combined them with modern science, with drugs and psychological conditioning, trying to create soldiers who would not fear, who would obey without hesitation. Miller listened, each word pulling the noose tighter. The professor tapped the figure again. This wasn't meant to be decoration. It was a focus, a ritual object used to anchor whatever changes they forced on those men. If your Hudson brought this back from captivity, then he was part of something that should never have touched American soil. Back at the house, the forensic team widened their search. In the basement, beneath layers of grime, they began to notice markings. At first they looked like scratches on the brick, accidents of time. But when photographed under angled light, they revealed themselves. Faint etchings of the same symbols from the book and from the figurine. Circles with stars enclosed, lines radiating outward like a sun, shapes that looked too deliberate to be dismissed as chance. It was as if someone had carved reminders of the rituals into the very walls, sealing them into the foundation. Then came the most chilling discovery. One of the technicians noticed discoloration in the packed earth floor at the far corner. The ground was darker there, stained in irregular patterns. When samples were tested, the results were clear: blood. Miller ordered an excavation. The work was slow, the soil heavy with moisture. At a depth of 3 feet, a bone surfaced. Then another, and another. Not a single skeleton, but fragments, pieces arranged carefully, not dumped. A ribcage here, a skull there, bones aligned in deliberate arcs. As more soil was removed, the pattern became undeniable. The remains had been laid out in the form of a symbol, a many-pointed star encircled by bones. At least 5 individuals, each buried at different times, but all within the years John Hudson lived in the house. The medical examiner's report was clinical, almost cold. Remains consistent with 5 adults. Dates of death estimated between 1955 and 1964. But to Miller, standing in that basement, it was more than numbers. It was the confirmation that Mary Hudson had not been her husband's only victim. The knife, the diary, the figurine, and now the bones, set like offerings beneath the house. The pieces no longer suggested coincidence. They revealed a design. John Hudson had not simply killed. He had built something, a ritual, carried out step by step, hidden beneath the silence of his neighbors and the complacency of old police files. For decades the house had sat quietly, waiting, and now its secrets were coming out one layer of soil at a time. Andrew hesitated before speaking again. His eyes moved to the window, as though he expected to see his father's shadow still waiting outside. Then he drew in a breath and told Miller about the envelope. "It was right before he died," Andrew said. "He gave it to me and told me not to open it unless I learned the truth about what happened to my mother. I forgot about it for years, but after you came, I remembered." Andrew brought out a yellowed envelope, its seal cracked with age. Inside was a letter, written in John Hudson's uneven hand. The words were jagged, almost desperate, scrawled across the page. "I killed her," it began, "and I killed 6 others. But it was never mine to choose. They told me what to do. The voices, always the voices." Miller read in silence as the confession spilled forward. John wrote that he had been chosen during the war, taken as a prisoner for experiments that changed him. "They broke me open," the letter said. "They put something inside. Since then, I hear them every night. They say I must build the gate. 7 lives to open the way, 6 to shape the key, and the 7th to unlock it." The 6th victim had been Mary. The 7th, he admitted, was meant to be Andrew. "You were to be the last," the letter said. "The final one, but I could not do it. I could not kill my own blood. So I ran. I thought if I left, they would leave me too. But the voices followed. They never stopped." At the bottom of the envelope was a photograph. It showed a group of hollow-eyed men in ragged uniforms, standing with German officers. In the center was John Hudson, younger, thinner, his gaze already broken. On the back, in German script, were the words, "Subject number 17. Survivor." Miller closed the letter, the paper trembling slightly in his hands. The confession was more than words. It was the echo of a life twisted beyond repair. John Hudson had been both victim and killer, shaped by forces darker than anyone had ever imagined. And the unfinished ritual still hung in the air, waiting. The case was closed on paper. Mary Hudson's remains were laid to rest in the town cemetery, the headstone etched with her name after nearly 40 years in silence. The house where her life had ended was demolished. Where its walls once stood, a fresh foundation was poured for new homes, clean and ordinary. The official files spoke of resolution, of justice found too late. But Miller knew better. He had stood in that basement, seen the symbols carved into brick, seen bones arranged into shapes no grieving hand would ever make. He had read John Hudson's letter and felt the madness in its words. There was no true ending here, only an uneasy pause. Weeks later, an envelope arrived at Miller's desk. No return address, no fingerprints. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed in stark black letters. "They are still here. The gate can be opened." Miller locked the note in his drawer, but that night the words followed him home. They repeated in his head like a whisper he couldn't shut out. He drank, but the echo remained. Then the killings began. The first body was found in Pittsburgh, a businessman carved with a star inside a circle across his chest. 40 days later, another, then another. Each victim marked with the same symbol John Hudson had left in his basement. Police called them copycats, ritual-obsessed killers chasing attention. Miller knew different. He had seen the pattern before, the 40-day cycle, the precision of the cuts. It wasn't imitation. It was continuation. He tried to warn his superiors. He brought out the diary, the photographs, the German officer's notes, the figurine. They shook their heads. Too old. Too implausible. They told him to let it go. But he couldn't. Miller began his own investigation, traveling from city to city, mapping the killings. The points formed a shape across the map, a star enclosed by a circle, stretching wider with each death. He realized the ritual was no longer bound to one house, one man. It was spreading piece by piece, victim by victim. And then, one winter evening in 1995, Robert Miller vanished. His apartment was left in order, his notes stacked neatly on the table. The only thing missing was the letter, the one that had warned him that the gate could still be opened. Some say he went mad, consumed by an obsession with a case too strange to be real. Others believe he was taken by the same force that once whispered to John Hudson. The files remain locked away, and the killings, those strange marked deaths, continue to appear, scattered across the country, dismissed as isolated crimes. But the pattern grows, and so does the silence. If you ever come across that symbol, a star with too many points enclosed in a circle, do not linger. Do not trace it with your eyes. Do not try to understand. Turn away. Walk away. Because those who stare too long begin to hear the same voices that drove John Hudson, the same voices that haunted Robert Miller. And once the voices find you, they do not let go.